Welcome. Let's talk about social inclusion. And let's talk about how people perceive inequality between different groups and how those perceptions influence their support for policies that aim to create a more level society. I have invited Arnim Langer to join this conversation and to talk about fairness, social cohesion, and the power dynamics at play in a multi-ethnic world. I'm Rodrigo Silva. Let's talk about social inclusion. Arnim, welcome to our episode.
Thank you very much.
So there is extensive research on attitudes towards reducing inequality between rich and poor, the so-called vertical inequality, but little research, apparently, you say this on your article, on attitudes towards reducing inequality between ethnic groups, so horizontal one. So is this why this study was born?
Yes, I think that you put it very nicely. There's a lot of research, as you referred to it, between the redistribution attitude between the poor and the rich, vertical inequalities. But when it comes to group-based or horizontal inequalities, and we're thinking in that context about, for instance, ethnic group or caste groups or religious groups, there's actually quite little research done in understanding what are the main determinants of people's attitudes towards this group-based redistribution, what we call horizontal redistribution as well. Now, our paper is focusing on Nigeria, but it's part of a larger special issue which actually looks at these issues across the globe and has cases on Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Malaysia, United States. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is actually that these group-based inequalities or horizontal inequalities are actually present in many of these societies. And these are issues that are incredibly important and deserve to be researched. And the focus of our paper is Nigeria, which is a fascinating country and an instructive case for studying these issues, not only because it's a multi-ethnic society with three dominant groups, the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the southwest, and the Igbo in the southeast, but also because it's a country that has, over the years, actually since independence, introduced a whole range of measures and policies in order to address these group-based inequalities. Most notably, was the introduction of the Federal Character Commission in 1996, which was really aimed at maintaining fair and equal distribution across ethnic groups when it comes to, for instance, public positions and the distribution of all kinds of government contracts. But the inequalities are still very severe in Nigeria. And hence that offered us a sort of an interesting and intriguing question, actually, how people perceive these policies that have been undertaken and to what extent they support it or actually against these policies.
So let's follow up on it. Good context for the study. So what are these determinants? What are the main highlights of what you found?
Well, the thing is, has been a lot of research, as you mentioned, on attitudes towards vertical inequality, so between the rich and the poor, or sometimes people refer to as class-based inequalities. And that was sort of the basis for us to look at that literature and see whether certain elements or hypotheses or theories that are present in that literature could actually be tested also, and could also help to explain attitudes towards horizontal redistribution, so redistribution between groups. And from that perspective, that was the basis. We also looked, I have to say, that's a different literature, but also an important literature. We looked at the literature that focused on attitudes towards affirmative action in the United States. That is actually quite a large literature which focuses on group-based redistribution, but it's really the United States that has been picked out as a country that most of the research focuses on the United States. Now, those are the two literatures that we took as the basis for starting to theorize about possible drivers of people's attitudes towards redistribution. Now, what we found, there are a couple of things that we found. First of all, the fact that the perceived severity of the prevailing inequalities is an important driver of people's attitudes. Now, it goes very much along what people intuitively would think. The more severe people think inequalities are, the more likely they are to support redistribution. But I do have to add immediately here that we also find that people's perception of the prevailing inequalities might actually differ from the objective situation. And that is quite important because that in turn tells you something that people might misperceive and hence might misperceive the actual situation. And because of that, might have an influence on their attitudes. Another important driver is the fact that relates to, I should say, to how people perceive the origins of the prevailing inequalities. And in that regard, what comes out and comes out very strongly in our data is the fact that the more people put the responsibility for the disadvantagement that certain groups have with the groups themselves or the group members themselves, the more they are against redistribution. Conversely, the more people think that the inequalities are the result of contextual factors or historical factors, such as, for instance, discrimination by past regimes, the more they are in favor of redistribution. Now, and then the last element that jumps out is there are a number of additional ones in the paper, but are fairness considerations. Fairness consideration is the more people think the existing inequalities are unfair, the more they support redistribution, group-based redistribution towards disadvantaged groups. And fairness consideration is an element, for instance, that also comes out in the literature of vertical redistribution, also in measures aimed at reducing class-based or inequality in poor and rich. That also jumps out in group-based inequalities. And it's important that, we emphasize in this regard that fairness considerations might differ between countries. I mean, there's a lot of research showing that, for instance, fairness considerations in the United States are very different from fairness considerations in European countries. Similarly, it might differ between individuals, and that's also what we notice. And there's a lot to be learned in this regard in terms of what drives these fairness considerations and norms of social justice in this regard, where they come from. And that is definitely something interesting to further research in this regard.
Yeah, we'll go there. So a lot about how the perception can be different from the reality if the origin of the problem is by the group themselves, issues of fairness. So in a nutshell, what could policymakers do with these findings? So if they listen to this episode and they heard these findings, so what could they do? Practical implications of this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, the first thing to take from these findings is actually the fact that you cannot just rely on the objective situation. And that is something that we tend to do because survey data and perceptual data are not readily available. So we go back to objective data and say, okay, this is the situation. But once we realize that people's actions and support for policies is very much driven by the perception of reality that they hold. And we add to that the fact that we actually see that people's perception of the prevailing inequalities, of the actual inequalities, can be very much different from the actual situation. Putting that together tells us that if we want to design policy and if we want to think about introducing, if policymakers are considering introducing policies and maybe increasing popular support for policies, which is necessary if you want to maintain these policies for a longer period of time, then it's crucial to really come to grips and understand people's perception of the prevailing situation. Because linked to that is, even when there are policymakers considering introducing policies to address horizontal inequalities, one of the things is that horizontal inequalities has shown themselves to be incredibly persistent. So it's not unheard of that disadvantaged groups remain in positions of inferiority for decades or even centuries. So these policies need to be in place for a long period of time in order to have some effect on the actual inequalities. But that also requires that you need to have popular support for these policies. And that is really something driven by perceptions. And hence, we need to see whether policymakers need to be aware of that if they want to be able to introduce a successful policy that can actually count on popular support or widespread support among the population.
Let's take a step back. Let's follow up on what you were saying before. So if you could tell us more about now future research, so perhaps some other dimensions to be included in this analysis, Or even you said some more national comparisons, as you said, these country differences. So what's ahead of us now?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, we see this as a start because it's a fascinating area of research where little research has been done. And that for a researcher, that obviously opens doors for many avenues of future research. Now, the first area of future research is actually linked to a research limitation of the current research. So we conducted an online survey among 2,700 Nigerian adults. But our sample was obviously not nationally representative. And the sample that we collected was online. We used Facebook targeting to recruit our sample. So the first avenue of future research is to extend this research into a nationally representative sample and see how people in different contexts in Nigeria think about these issues. Because clearly, when you do an online survey in English, you introduce certain biases in your survey sample. And you often have a relatively higher educated group that you talk to, but you also, and which is often urban based, but you obviously in Nigeria for sure, many people live in rural areas. So you miss out on those people. So that will be a first step to extend it in Nigeria towards a more national representative sample. The other thing is to extend it to other countries. As I said, there has not been a lot of research on this, particularly in the global south. I think many of these studies could be extended to other cases and could lead to certain comparisons between countries. A third broad avenue could actually be to further zoom in on perceptions of horizontal inequalities. Now, what we find is indeed that people's perceptions of the prevailing severity of the prevailing horizontal inequalities is an important driver of their attitudes towards redistribution. But how stable these perceptions are and whether they change over time and what are the drivers of people's perceptions, that are interesting elements as well. And again, not much has been done on this in a systematic way. So that would be definitely very intriguing to further zoom in on. Now, fourthly, I think there's also, we had 4 main hypotheses that we tested. And that were 4 mechanisms or 4 drivers of the prevailing attitudes towards redistribution. There are obviously elements that we haven't looked at, right? People's perceptions of social mobility, for instance. We haven't looked at that because we hadn't any data on it. But that could be interesting. If people think that social mobility there is much higher than other people think, that might have an impact on their attitudes because they think, well, there's a chance that you made it on yourself, or on that might influence whether the government-led redistribution is appropriate. The other thing is clearly what I find intriguing in that regard would also be whether we could give certain informational cues about the objective situation and whether that could actually help change people's perceptions of the prevailing horizontal inequalities, and by that, change people's attitudes. I think that will be interesting as well in that regard. So plenty of avenues with fascinating research to be done.
Still a lot to work on the topic, many venues ahead. You made a very good reflection before about the policy impact of these perceptions and how they should be added to considerations to policy impact beyond just the objective case. But let us know more about your personal thoughts, your personal reflections after looking at these findings.
Yeah, I mean, I think, doing research, I've been doing a lot of, for a long time, research on horizontal inequalities. And I always, the first 10 years, I looked at the relationship between the presence of group-based inequalities, these horizontal inequalities, and the risk of violent conflict. And it was sort of a natural evolution going into, but how do people perceive? Because actually people act and react on the basis of their perception of reality rather than some objective standards. And that realization is really fascinating because, as I said, by just talking about future avenues of research, to me, finding evidence that perceptions are such an important driver of these attitudes, and with that, the possibility of actually doing something about these inequalities, that I find fascinating. And intriguing for me, myself, and something that we're working on, or starting to work on, is whether indeed experimental research can find out, by means of experimental research, you can find out whether these certain informational cues can actually help correct people's misperception of the prevailing situation. Because I do find that very important. If we think about the way where people get their news from or where people get their information from and how they sometimes are manipulated in political contexts during election times and et cetera. Correcting and making sure that people have a correct perception of the situation might actually be very important, not only for creating support for policies that are actually necessary in order to improve the situation vis-a-vis horizontal inequalities, but I also think it's absolutely necessary from a long-term stability point of view to address these inequalities. There's been a huge amount of research that has linked presence of these inequalities to an increased risk of political instability, violent conflicts, and economic inefficiencies. Now, if we can make that clearer, if that becomes clearer to people and that there is a need to redistribute in order to overcome these inequalities, that could really help contribute towards making more stable and socially cohesive societies. But it's a difficult and long policy process. Let that be clear.
Mm-hmm. No, that's perfect. And now the challenge, but the other way around. So if you had to, these reflections of yours, these findings, if you had to sum up into sentences, this passion you just showed for the topic in 2 sentences, what would it be?
It would be perceptions matter. Just looking at the objective situation is not enough. If you want to improve and make multi-ethnic societies that are confronted with severe inequalities, which are many countries in the world, if you want to help them become more stable and socially cohesive societies, you need to address these inequalities. And you can only do that. You can only find the necessary popular support for policies that you need to introduce if you understand the perceptions that lay at the basis of these attitudes.
It was a great episode. Arnim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This podcast is powered by Cogitatu Press. You can listen to this episode on the Let's Talk About Social Inclusion website, on Cogitatu Press YouTube channel, and whatever you get your podcast.